So what was the world like in the New Testament world? Back up to chapter 4. In the New Testament world, which on my Bible's on the other page, the book of 1 Peter is a book set against the backdrop of impending persecution. Think about what's going on as Peter's writing this. Paul is already in prison, and Paul is awaiting execution. Paul. Can you imagine the shockwave going through the church? I mean, if you've ever heard of Billy Graham, put Billy Graham on about a tenfold scale, and you've got the Apostle Paul. Almost everybody in the world owed hearing about the gospel, every Gentile at least, to Paul. And he wrote half the New Testament. He planted the majority of those early churches across the arc of the Roman Empire. And now he's on death row. And people are thinking, what's going to happen? So Paul's in prison. Number 2, Peter's on the run. They're hunting for Peter. Peter was the most well-known of the apostles. He was Christ's buddy. He was the one that was always following and bumping into Jesus. He was known as the rock, and actually Christ was the rock, but the world began to think that Christ was building his church on Peter. And so the empire wanted to get him. So God directs Peter to write a book about hope and peace. And Peter chose one of the most difficult places to write it. He chose to write it and direct it toward the people in the target of the emperor. Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, Roman province of Asia. And to those people who lived in the center of all that was Rome, Peter says, suffering is coming. And he says it 15 times. If someone says something 15 times, you kind of figure out what they're talking about. I mean, if they just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and say, I said it, and say it again. Peter said, suffering is coming. And so in the center of those in the most secular, emperor-worshipping, hostile to the gospel territory in the Roman Empire, Peter said, you're living where it's all going to come down. And you're going to face the fire of chapter 4. Look what he says in verse 12. Don't think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you. That's what Peter was telling them, that they were going to face horrible tortures. Horrible tortures. I mean, torture, I've never been tortured. I've been put in jail, and I've been arrested, and I've been expelled, and all kinds of stuff, but I'll never forget the first person I saw that was tortured. In the 70s, when I was in college, I used to go for the summers, while everybody else was enjoying Camp Barracuda and working the waterfront. I would smuggle Bibles. That's what I did in my college summers. And it was really fun. It was very exciting to go into communist countries and Muslim countries and to see how many Bibles you could get in a truck or in a car. Usually we'd have 1,800 in a car, and usually when we had a truck, we'd have 6,000. But the problem is when we'd go into Muslim countries, we would address them with the believer's name and address to try and mail it to them. Because you can't mail from outside of Islam because they censor all their mails. So if you could get them in the country, you could mail them to any of the 22 Arabic Islamic Dar el-Islam, the world of Islam that's in the Arab-speaking world. And so we would smuggle those things in. And I remember once we were delivering, we wanted to get them out of our car and get out of that country before we got caught. And so we would just be shoveling them like this, and we would hand them to the Christians that would receive them. And I remember I was just shoveling along. One time, I put the handful of Bibles into the hands of a believer who had been working with us all summer. And he reached his hands out, and I took the Bibles back because I looked at his fingernails. All of his fingernails were over a 1/4 inch thick. All of his fingernails were dark brown, and he didn't paint them. They weren't, sculptured, manicured nails. Something had damaged. They were ridged. They were dark brown and ridged and really thick. So I took the Bibles back, and I said, what happened to you? And he went like this. I said, what happened to you? Oh, he said, this was the second year I worked with him. He said, after you left, they got us. I said, what is they got us? He says, this was in Romania, by the way. He said, they found the Bibles. So he said, I didn't know what they were going to do. And he said, they took me to the police station. And he said, they got me on my knees like this. And they tied my hand to a post. And he said, and the policeman came walking up with his jackknife and a little tiny 2x4, and he was slicing off little strips of 2x4. And he said he got them, and he pushed them, strips, under every one of my fingernails. And my fingers like this. And he says, after he got, in both hands, he said, then after he got done, he reached in his pocket and got his lighter. And he lit those little strips of pine. And he said they burned up under all my fingernails. And he says, and that's what happens after you have burning wood. They grow back. God made us have a lot of great parts of our body that go against adversity. But he said, for the last year, they're coming out brown and ridged. And I thought, and you're here getting another handful? I mean, if they had done that to me last summer, I wouldn't have returned. I would have gone to the waterfront at Barrack Hill. That would have been a better summer serving the Lord than that. Well, the third time I met him, that was the first time when he got caught. The second time when I saw it. The third time I met him, delivering, I said, Boaz, how are you doing? He said, they didn't do that this time. He said, I just got back to work. He said, after they caught me this time, he said, they tied my feet this time to the rail. And I thought, what are they going to do, the toenail thing now? And he said, no, the guy walked out with a garden hose and was going like this. And he said, they spent hours taking turns beating the bottom of my feet. If you know anything about acupuncture and all that stuff, a lot of our nerves go all the way down to the bottom of our feet. And if you hit someone's feet long enough, they are so impaired, he actually was unable to walk for 6 months just because of the total nerve damage to his body. And he said, I was out of work for 6 months, and he says, I just got back to my job, and I said, and you're receiving Bibles again? He said, yeah. He said, what else is there to live for? He lived in a communist country. He lived in oppression. He lived as a second-class person, as a Christian. And he says, if I can just be part of sharing the gospel with anyone, he said, it makes life worth living. What makes our lives worth living? See, we just have a whole different value system than these people did. Well, they faced horrible tortures, and look what happens. Let's not just stay with the bad stuff. Look at verse 13. This is what keeps us going. They experienced divine comfort. See, if you suffer, Jesus said, I'm right with you when you suffer. And verse 13 says, but you rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when his glory is revealed, you also will be glad with exceeding joy. You have never met Boaz. I've met him 3 times with his fingernails and his feet and everything else. Did you know in heaven, Paul says that to the extent we suffered for Christ on earth is to the extent that we began to experience the wonders. How Paul put it is this in 2 Corinthians. He says, for our light momentary affliction, that's suffering, worketh in us an exceeding and eternal weight of glory. The people that are going to be glowing in heaven are not the ones whose faces were all illumined by lights on television, and they were putting makeup on them and getting their hair just right so they could be Christian movie star personalities and selling everything that they sell and inviting you to their theme park or their whatever, of some of the excesses of the past. The ones that are going to glow in heaven are the ones that had an exceeding and eternal weight of glory because they went through, in perspective of eternity, light momentary afflictions. They suffered. Their fingernails, their feet, they were beaten. Here in verse 12, they were burnt at the stake like Polycarp was. Amazing. Keep reading in verse 14. But if you're reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. When that professor at Michigan State, my opening day at Michigan State, and said the Bible's mythology, he was wearing his unicorn horn and his crazy shorts and all that stuff. I never told you what he did. He just went, like, what a weirdo, a dinosaur. All you guys, look at that weirdo in the back. He reproached me is what he did. I mean, really, I should have filed an abuse suit, because he made fun of me. He pointed me out. But did you know what? In that moment, look at verse 14. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of Christ rests upon you. On their part, he's blasphemed, but on your part, he's glorified. Every time we act or look enough like Jesus Christ that the world hates and reproaches us, in that instant, look what verse 14 says, the Spirit of glory and of Christ rests upon you. I remember as I was sitting down to the mocking sneer of Mr., puffing cigarette mocking me, there was this joy that I didn't even know what it was until after class when all the kids came. Let's study the Bible. See, God always, out of the devil's evil, brings forth something eternally good. But if you never stand up for Christ, if you never say, I believe in him, if you never put the Bible on the top of your pile, if you never pass out the tract to the person that mocks you and throws it on the floor, you'll never get to experience this thrill, this divine comfort.